morning, and welcome to the Africa Weekly Talk. Today's subject on the docket is a little bit controversial, but damn it, I'm going to say it anyway. There was an interview done by Tavis Smiley. If you guys know about Tavis Smiley, he's a black American dude. He used to be a news guy with PBS in America. And Tavis Smiley had this interview with Vlad TV where he had made a comment about how Barack Obama's presidency has set back black Americans in America. And just last week, he retreated that same comment again. And a friend of mine who happens to work for NBC asked me about it, and I stated emphatically to him that in some sense and in some ways, he might have a point, but I don't really agree with that statement by Tavis Smiley. But there's one thing I agree, and I can emphatically say when comparing Barack Hussein Obama's presidency to George W. Bush's presidency and their policies towards the continent, Africa, the African continent. In that sense, I can emphatically say that George W. Bush was a better U.S. president for Africa than Barack Hussein Obama. And I said, damn it, I said it and I will say it again. George W. Bush was a better U.S. president for Africa than Barack Hussein Obama. I know this is going to create a lot of buzz among African Americans and Africans and all of that. I get it, because Barack Hussein Obama is our beloved African child who happens to be the first African American president of America, which was very symbolic. Very, very symbolic. I went to Obama's inauguration. I voted for Barack Obama twice. I love Obama. I have nothing against Barack Obama. I mean, even if you look at my background here, there's a picture of Barack Obama right there. And I have a lot of pictures that in America, because of the contributions that I did to the Democratic Party, I have some of his Christmas party pictures and all of that stuff, you know. So I love him. But you have to call a spade a spade. I mean, the fact that I love the man doesn't mean that if somebody did better for the African continent, I don't have to acknowledge that. I'm sorry, my brothers and sisters. I get it. It's George W. Bush. But in terms of overall American presidency, Barack Obama was a better president than George W. Bush. If you talk about the overall America, I mean, when you judge the base of American, the country, and everything centered on American policies in America, yes, Barack Obama was a way, way better president than George W. Bush. But when it comes to Africa, that is where my argument is. When it comes to Africa, the continent Africa, it's not even close. It's not even close. And the data speaks for itself. I mean, George Bush came into office with an ideology of ending poverty all over the world and all that stuff. Because he's a very conservative, Christian guy, goes to church and all that stuff. But he was also introduced to the AIDS crisis that was crippling Africa from A to Z. I mean, when he was in office, the AIDS crisis was a big problem of all of Africa and around the world. So that time National Security Advisor, who was Condoleezza Rice, talked to him about the AIDS crisis. And from that point, George Bush never turned back on that issue towards Africa. I mean, he allocated money to the United Nations, about $200 or $300 million, specifically for that AIDS crisis in Africa. And within about 6 or 7 months, he realized the United Nations was going too slow on dealing with the situation. So what did George Bush do? George Bush went to the Congress of the United States, requested $15 billion of aid for Africa to help curb the AIDS pandemic going on in Africa at that time. Even his own advisors. That is what great leaders do. You see, great leaders always stand up for what they believe in. And that is one thing I always admire George Bush for. No matter how you talk or what you thought about him, he always stood his ground on what he believed in. You can never take that from George W. Bush. When he went to Congress and proposed this humanitarian aid for the helping to curb the AIDS epidemic in Africa, his own advisors in the White House, as well as congressional advisors, I mean the Republicans who were then in charge of both houses, okay, they were in charge of both houses, told him point blank. They told George Bush, look, if you come here with this thing about spending $15 billion within 5 years for Africa on AIDS, your presidency is doomed. You know what George Bush told them? George W. Bush told them, you know what? If that is what will do my presidency, so be it. This is a humanitarian crisis, and I'm going to stick my head for it. And what did he do? He went ahead and did it. And you know what? In the end, his own political party, the Republicans, 40 of them in the House voted against it, but he had enough Democrats in both houses to pass that bill. And he wasn't even done yet. He wasn't even done yet. He also implemented the Mothers Against AIDS preventive program, where he also added about $600 or something million to that program for Africa as well. I mean, when you talk about Africa and you talking about what George Bush did for Africa as president of America, I know it's very controversial because a lot of people look at George Bush and they look at the Iraq war and all that stuff. But let's center on Africa. There's no American president. There's no American president that has done more or did more for the continent of Africa than George W. Bush. So we Africans, we have to always hold George W. Bush very high because he did more than our own fellow African child who ended up becoming American president. And I get it. I'm not saying Obama could have done more or should have done more. Obama came in as president of the United States of America. He wasn't elected president of Africa or president of Black Americans or African Americans. So the conservative media was already trying to paint him as the minority president. And I get it. Anytime he tried to do something, they will stick that on him. So Obama was very cautious. So he tried not to ruffle feathers with that issue. But the problem I had with Barack Obama was that he tried to please everybody. And in life, he can't please everybody. That's a real fact. He tried to please all the political parties, you know, some of his Republican friends, some of his Democratic colleagues, and all of that. So he didn't really have clear agendas when it came to policies, except one or two policies, which is, let's say, the Obamacare. But when it comes to Africa, which is what I'm talking about, my fellow brothers and sisters, it is not even close. It is not even close when you're talking about what George W. Bush did for Africa and comparing that to what Barack Hussein Obama did for Africa. Barack Hussein Obama came up with a program which was basically private U.S. companies like Coca-Cola, Google, General Electric, Walmart, initiative where basically funds and businesses were going to contribute with the U.S. government in helping Africa in certain economic developments, which was all well and good too. But when you talk about the substance, the substance of it, of what George W. Bush did for Africa and what Barack Hussein Obama did, it's not even close, my fellow brothers and sisters. It's not even close. So I raised this issue with my friend, who happens to be a news guy, with NBC. I don't like to mention names. I'm not going to mention his name. But he's a very good friend of mine. I've known him for a while, and he agreed. We agreed. We were on pretty much the same terms, in terms of, because, most of the media in America are liberal. So anything associated with Bush, it always goes to the Iraq War and all that stuff. His conservative stance on abortion and all that stuff. So Bush wasn't liked until Trump came in. That's when they realized that, not knowing, Bush was way better than Trump. But other than that, Bush was never liked by the conservative, by the liberal media in America. And they control pretty much all the news. So if you look at George Bush's presidency and his policies towards Africa, a clear example, like for instance, when you go to Ghana, when George Bush came out with the Democracy Project, which has been started by his Clinton, or even prior to Clinton, his father, George Bush's father, H. Bush. And basically what that project did was the good African democratic countries that were leaning towards democracies and who have been in the democratic process for maybe 8, 10, 12 years with no issues in terms of human rights abuses and all that stuff, the US government was giving them aid in the form of infrastructure development and also for other health, pipe-borne water, health, diseases, and all those things. And what that program did, if you guys in Ghana will remember, some years back when George Bush was president of America, that N1, which is called George Bush Highway, was built when I think Kufuor was then the president of Ghana. That highway was built by the US government under George Bush because of that program. Because Ghana was awarded at that time as the country for being moving towards the democratic elections and all that stuff. So the US government built the N1 for Ghana. And that is why they call it George Bush Highway. Forget about that. That's not the only one he did. Outside of Ghana, they did some also in other African countries. Because it was a project that was going on with various African countries. So every African country that was showing signs of democracy and all that, good humanitarian policies towards its citizens and stuff, then the money will be awarded and the project will be built, depending on what project is available for them. And outside of that, George Bush also was the first US president to go to Congress and ask specifically money for the continent of Africa. Because most of the times when the US presidents go to Congress to ask for these things, it is added into the budget and it goes through maybe State Department or US aid. But with this particular AIDS program issue, what he did, he went straight to the Congress, and that money, a bill was passed specifically for that. And that is when the Republican colleagues in the House of Representatives, as well as his own advisors, advised him not to do it. But he did it. But a lot of people don't know about it. That is one of the key legacies of George Bush for Africa. And no US president ever did what that man did for Africa. He gave over what? About $600 billion. $600 billion also for so many humanitarian programs for Africa and all over the world. But a lot of times when people talk about George Bush, they don't know a lot about these things that George Bush did for Africa and the rest of the world, especially when it comes to poverty and helping build developing countries into democratic societies and all of that. Everything about George Bush is centered on Iraq war, but not the humanitarian that this guy was. And I know I know, I get it. I get it. People are going to be like, oh, why are you talking so good about George Bush and this and this and that and that? No, I'm not talking good about George Bush just for the sake of talking about George Bush. Okay? George Bush even increased the aid from the US government to Africa by 600% when he was president of America. Obama came into office, reduced the aid that the US government was giving to Africa. Because at that time, we had the 2008 economic crisis. So they have to cut the budget on so many things. So I can cut Obama some slack on that. So he had to do certain things that wasn't, favorable to most outside of the United States because of that. Because he has to look inwards, things that will help benefit the US internally instead of externally. So I get that. But outside of all of that, if you look as the presidency of George Bush and Barack Hussein Obama in terms of what these two people did for Africa, I said, look, I mean, there's nothing more I can say to you fellows that it is not about symbolism. I get it. This is about substance. Okay, symbolism has its place and substance also has its place. Okay, because at the end of the day, Obama was a symbolic president. The first African-American president, the first black president, and there was a lot of glow around Barack Hussein Obama. I love Barack Hussein Obama. I voted for this man twice. Okay? I have a picture of him right there on my background. Okay? I contributed to his political action committee contribution. I did that. As a matter of fact, I even wrote a letter even before he ran against Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary for president. I still have that letter that I mailed it and it was received by Obama, who was then a senator. And I made the argument why it was right for him to run for president at that time, because that was the right opportunity for him. So this is not about me not liking Obama or taking Bush over Obama, but this is about facts, my fellow Africans. This is about fact. And I'm talking about it because of that interview that Tavis Smiley did, in which he also said that Obama's presidency has pretty much set Black Americans or African Americans back in America. I don't really agree with what Tavis Smiley said on that. The only thing I can say about that is that, I mean, with regards to Africa, there's one thing I can say, and that one I can say with my head up, that Barack Hussein Obama was a good American president and was a good world president. There's no two ways about it. He was better than George Bush in that area. But when it comes to Africa, George W. Bush was a better US president for Africa than Barack Hussein Obama. I mean, do you know how much did George Bush aid, $15 billion aid to Africa, help decrease the adult mortality rate of Africa? That aid alone reduced about 20% of adult mortality rate among women in Africa because of George Bush. That aid that George Bush gave to Africa, do you know how much that money helped with the distribution of the AIDS and medications that went to a lot of almost every African country, especially South Africa, which was going through hell with the AIDS pandemic at that time? So if we're talking about in terms of what George W. Bush did as well as what Barack Obama did, and you are comparing policy-wise, I take my hats off to George W. Bush. I mean, Obama did his part. He did well. I mean, he was good. I mean, he did okay. And I can understand it because he would have been eaten alive by the conservative media in America if he had stuck his head towards Black American or African American issues as well as African issues upfrontly. He could have done some things though in terms of Africa, because in foreign policies you have some grounds that usually the US president have when it comes to foreign policy, in terms of some of the things he could have done with executive orders and stuff. That he didn't need Congress to do it. But George Bush stuck his head out and fought his way through on these issues. And he said, "What? You know what? This is an humanitarian crisis, and I'm going to go all the way for it. If you guys don't want me to go for it, I'm sorry. This is what I'm going to do." And he stuck his head out and he did it, and he was able to allocate, up to this date, over $100 billion that the United States government have sent to the world, including Africa, mostly to Africa, in terms of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and how that has reduced the AIDS situation in Africa today. So kudos to George Bush. So fellow Africans, I mean, this is just facts. This is the data. I'm stating fact. This is my opinion. And when it's very difficult to ignore facts when the facts are right in front of you. So our son, African son, Barak Hussein Obama, was a good president. But when it came to Africa, George W. Bush was a better president for Africa than Barak Hussein Obama. He was a symbolic president, and that's not going to change anything, which is very good for the Africa and America as well, in terms of what he did for the world when he became president of the United States of America. But in terms of policy-wise, towards Africa, there is no way I can say that George Bush or Obama did more than George Bush did for Africa. George Bush did more, way more for Africa. As a matter of fact, within the Justice Department of America, it was the same George Bush who also had the criminal division of the Justice Department of America that went after the corrupt former presidents and former presidents of African countries who had stolen money that were in all of European banks and American banks all over the world. It was Bush time that they went after these criminals and was able to get some of their money for countries like Nigeria, especially Nigeria, because I know of Nigeria because of the Abacha's case, you know, and all happened under George W. Bush. Obama continued it, but it was started by George W. Bush. So kudos to George W. Bush, you know. And so fellow friends and fellow family and fellow Africans, this is facts. I'm sorry if this might hurt your feelings, but look, this is not about emotions. This is about facts, okay? If it's Sunday, it's the Africa Weekly Talk. God bless you guys and have a nice week. Thank you. Peace and love.